Hello, everyone. Welcome to How to Read Chinese Poetry podcast. I'm Zong-qi, the program host. In this podcast program, my colleagues and I aim to introduce cutting-edge scholarship on Chinese poetry to a broad general audience. We will present 52 episodes covering the major poetic genres developed over China's long history. Each episode features close reading of one or more of the best-known Chinese poems, with an aim to illuminate their literary greatness and cultural significance. For all the discussed poems, Chinese text, English translation, romanization, and brief notes are provided at our website, howtoreadchinesepoetry.com. By following the 52 episodes, listener will gain a bird's-eye view of the thematic, formal, and generic evolution of Chinese poetry from antiquity to the modern era. Instruct and delight is what we wish to accomplish in each talk. Without further ado, let's begin. Today, our guest host, Professor Bender, will present episode 23 entitled Tao Qian's Fields and Gardens. Let's welcome Professor Bender.
Tao Qian, also known as Tao Yanming, is one of the 3 or 4 most beloved poets in China's history, and his poetry is instantly recognizable as the progenitor and paradigm of the genre that came to be called poetry of fields and gardens. In much of his work, Tao chronicles his daily affairs in the rural landscape of his hermitage, on the margin between the human realm of court and city and the further wildernesses of mountains and waters. As we saw in the last episode, mountain landscapes had by Tao Qian's time long been a topic of poetry, but these landscapes were largely generic and mostly imaginary, since most poets of the time in fact lived in and wrote for the human world. Tao's fields and gardens, by contrast, were a space in which a person could actually make a life, and his poetry is compelling in part because he's honest about the difficulties he had in doing so. Tao Qian was born into a family of government officials, and though the death of his father when he was a child meant that he did not enjoy the benefit of high society in his youth, he nonetheless managed to obtain both civil and military office. The poetry that survives from these stints as an official shows that he was always conflicted about serving, and frequently yearned to return to his hometown in Chaisang to live as a recluse. At around age 40, he finally made the decision to give up on his government career. It's from this point forward that he begins to write his most famous poetry, much of which describes his contentment with his decision to leave elite society behind, and some of which details the hardships he experienced on account of that decision. Among the most famous of the poems that Tao wrote about his decision to pursue reclusion in his hometown is a set of 5 verses composed shortly after abandoning his last official post as magistrate of Pengze. In these 5 poems, Tao describes his reasons for returning to dwell amidst fields and gardens, as well as some of the pleasures he found in his rural hermitage. Even more interesting, however, is the narrative traced by these 5 poems, as over their course, Tao's experience of his newly chosen lifestyle forces him to reconsider some of the ideas and stances that led him to adopt it. Because the series is relatively long, we will read now only the first poem and the last, though the middle poems are also translated in the PDF document that accompanies this podcast. Here is the first poem of the series.
Returning to dwell in fields and gardens. When I was young, I didn't rhyme with the vulgar. My nature was always to love hills and mountains. By mistake, though, I fell into the snares of dust, and once gone, 30 years. The caged bird yearns for its old forest. The fish in a pond longs for familiar deeps. So, clearing land on the edge of southern wilds, I'll hold to simplicity, returning to gardens and fields. My house sits on more than 10 acres. My thatched hut is 8 or 9 spans. Elm and willow shade the rear eaves. Peach and plum hang over the front of the hall. Indistinct, a far-off village of people, vaguely recognizable, their neighborhood's hearth smoke. Dogs bark from its remote alleys, and roosters crow in their mulberry. My gate and courtyard are free of dust and dirt. My empty rooms have plenty of leisurely space. Having been long inside a cage, again I get to return to what I am of myself.
In the first poem here, Tao explains why he decided to give up his official career, because his nature never rhymed with the human world and instead was always drawn to hills and mountains. Tao claims for this reason to have built a hut on the edge of the southern wilderness, as close as he could get to hills and mountains while still being able to farm and thereby feed himself. He is still, however, close enough to other humans to be able to see a village off in the distance and to be able to hear the villagers' dogs and roosters. But he keeps his gate closed and his house empty, occupied only by his immediate family and by leisurely space. In the second poem, he will go on to watch his neighbors from a distance without making any attempt to get to know them. Over the course of the series, however, Tao's resolve to isolate himself from other people begins to waver. Not only does the hard work of planting and hoeing prevent him from enjoying the woods and moors around his cottage, but farming freshly reclaimed wilderness turns out to provide only a precarious existence, as weeds seek always to take back the land they have lost, smothering his newly planted bean sprouts. And with those bean sprouts struggling, the arrival of the settling frost threatens to lead to lean months for Tao and his family, perhaps even to starvation, a possibility he contemplates in the fourth poem when, taking a day of rest to wander the woods and hills near his hermitage, he finds a ruined village now almost totally engulfed by the wilderness he has been working to tame. The series then ends with his return to his cottage.
Dejected, I return alone, staff in hand, walking the twisting path through the thickets. The mountain brook is clear and shallow, and meeting it, I wash my feet. Straining some new wine, with a chicken I invite my neighbors. The sun goes down, the room gets dark. Firewood serves in place of bright candles. Growing cheerful, we regret the evening's brevity. Once again, it is already dawning.
In this last poem of the series, Tao realizes he cannot live entirely on his own. And the point of inviting over the neighbors he previously showed no interest in meeting is not merely that one has to enjoy one's life while one has it. Instead, Tao specifically notes here that he'll share a chicken with them, a chicken that recalls the roosters he heard in the first poem crowing from his neighbor's mulberry trees. The implication seems to be that he hopes sharing one of his chickens now may make them willing to share their stores with him later, in case his attempts to tame the wilderness produce too meager a harvest to survive the winter. It is Tao's frank admission in these poems that the wilderness does not welcome him and that he needs the support of a human community that makes his depiction of the rural landscape surrounding his hermitage so compelling in this series. These poems do not pretend, as Lu Ji's poem did in the previous episode, that the mountains contain natural equivalents of the luxurious residences of the human world. Instead, Tao's landscapes are interesting, in part because they display a real recalcitrance to human habitation, forcing him in one of the most famous and most memorable images of Tao's poetry, found in the third poem of this series, to work at his fields from dawn until deep at night, returning, as he puts it, in the moonlight, with the hoe over his shoulder. Over the more than 20 years that Tao spent in reclusion, he encountered many lean years, some of which forced him to beg for food. He faced particular difficulty in the third year of his reclusion, when his house and fields burned in a wildfire in the last month of summer, too late for many of his crops to begin growing again. In the poem he wrote about this experience, therefore, Tao meditates once more upon human interdependence, but this time in a less hopeful key.
Caught by fire in the middle of the 6th month of the Wushen year. My rush hut I lodged in a narrow lane, content to decline visits from figured carriages. In midsummer, a steady wind blew hard. Forest and hut were suddenly burned up. Of my house, not even an eave is left. We shelter in a boat before the gate. Vast are the evenings of early autumn, and high the moon, about to be full. Fruits and vegetables begin to grow again, but the startled birds still have not returned. In the middle of the night, I stand and think far. A single gaze encompasses the 9 heavens. In my youth, I possessed a lonely integrity. All of a sudden, I'm over 40. My form and traces transformation can carry off. The abode of my spirit has long been lonely and idle. Resoluteness is a quality that I have naturally. Even jade stone is no harder. Raising my head, I imagine the time of Donghu, when they left surplus grain in the fields at night. Patting their bellies, they yearned for nothing, rose at dawn, and returned at dusk to sleep. But since I didn't meet with that time, I'll just water my western garden.
Tao begins this poem with his habitual assertion of contentment at having left high society behind. And though disaster strikes suddenly in the second couplet, his indifference to it merely reveals to him the jade-firm strength of his character and of his commitment to his chosen way of life. In a sense, that is, the fire completes his transcendence of mundane human preoccupations, a transcendence that is symbolized by the fact that, now that no trees and not even an eave of his house remain, there's nothing to block his view of the night sky, and his sweeping gaze thus encompasses the entire cosmos. And yet, even though the destruction of his material abode has revealed the transcendence of what he calls the abode of his spirit, Tao nonetheless finds himself, at the end of the poem, yearning for the better societies of earlier ages in human history, wherein even if his fields burned down, his neighbors would leave surplus grain in theirs for him to reap. Unable to expect that sort of help from his fellow men nowadays, he resolves merely to go water his burnt garden, a futile gesture, most likely, given how little time remained in the growing season. This poem articulates once again Tao Qian's deep ambivalence towards human society, an ambivalence that keeps him always perched on the margin between it and its antithesis, the beautiful but inhospitable natural world. Tao's poetry of fields and gardens is, for this reason, always a negotiation between these two realms, and it is as a negotiation that it represents a groundbreakingly sustained and serious engagement with a topic of landscape. For Tao, the natural world outside of cities was no longer merely a foil for social life, neither the phantasmagoric horrorscape of the Chuci, nor the fantasy articulated in so much 4th century poetry on mountains. The natural landscape was, instead, a place where one could really live, if tenuously, through labor, difficulty, and occasionally reliance on and even yearning for that very same human community Tao had originally hoped to escape.
Let us thank Professor Bender for such a stimulating talk. We look forward to his presentation of episode 24 next Tuesday. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Let's relax and listen to a reading of the poems in Mandarin.
陶潜，归园田居，其一。少无世俗韵，性本爱丘山。误落尘网中，一去30年。羁鸟恋旧林，池鱼思故渊。开荒南野际，守拙归园田。方宅10余亩，草屋8、9间。榆柳映后檐，桃李罗堂前。暧暧远人村，依依墟里烟。狗吠深巷中，鸡鸣桑树颠。户庭无尘杂，虚室有余闲。久在樊笼里，复得返自然。戊申岁6月中，浴火诗。陶潜。草庐寄穷巷，甘以辞华轩。正夏长风急，林氏顿稍烦。一宅无遗语，舫舟应门前。迢迢新秋夕，亭亭月江圆。果菜始复生，惊鸟尚未还。中宵著遥念，一畔周9天。总发报孤介，演出40年。行迹平画往，灵府常独闲。真刚自有志， 玉石乃非坚。遥想东户时，余粮宿中田。古妇无所思，朝起暮归眠。既已不欲资，且遂冠西园。